Hello and welcome. Today we'll be talking about AMSCO Chapter 22 for AP European History. Chapter 22 focuses on Western prosperity and Eastern communism, but it's really a story of the challenges of Eastern Europe and ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union. The crazy thing about this lecture is we are just about done with the content. We're just about done with the entire textbook for AP Euro. There'll be one more lecture after this around the cultural changes of the 1900s. Chapter 23 and 24, I kind of combine those two together. But this is the last new piece of content that'll take us up until 1989, which is generally where AP European History ends its course. So you can see how I've got my notes set up, focusing really on Eastern Europe here, the problems in Eastern Europe, the changes under Khrushchev and Gorbachev, and then a series of revolutions, 1956, 1968, 1989, that ultimately leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so to remind ourselves, we're talking about the Cold War here. The Cold War was from 1945 until 1989. And remember, in our previous chapter, we talked about how the world had been divided into two halves. There was Western Europe, the Western world, Western Europe plus the US. They were generally democratic, generally capitalist economies, members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And you might remember that Western Europe is doing quite well post-World War II. A lot of that is because of free trade. A lot of that is because the European nations begin to integrate and trade with each other. A lot of that is because of financial support from America because of the Marshall Plan. So Western Europe, including West Germany, recovers quite quickly, quite miraculously. In West Germany, it's called the West Germany miracle. Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union and its satellite nations that it controls, struggling quite a bit more. And so before we even get to anything, I'm actually going to add a box for context here. So we're in the middle of the Cold War. Again, Cold War is generally 1985 to 1989. Western Europe is free, democratic, and prospering economically. But Eastern Europe is totalitarian, it's controlled by the Soviet Union, and it struggles to recover after World War II. Today is partially about why they struggle to recover and what that means for the future of the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, the Soviet armies, the Soviet Union, Communist Russia, they had liberated and then occupied all of Western Europe. So all of these countries, Poland, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union is in control of those countries because they've conquered them from Nazi Germany. So when World War II ends, all of these Eastern European nations become part of what is known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact guaranteed military support to those Eastern European countries. But what it really did is it allowed the Soviet Union to monitor those nations, to make sure there aren't any rebellions, to make sure to control them. And what ultimately develops in Eastern Europe over the next 10 years, late 1940s and 1950s, is one-party government, sometimes called Stalinism. It's not really communism anymore. Communism is supposed to be all about sharing resources and workers owning the means of production. It's not really communism anymore. It's really Stalin. It is the Soviet Union controlling everything. And so when we looked at the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union, we looked at the 5-year plans, which rapidly industrialized the country. But we also saw how the Soviet Union intentionally starved people in Ukraine who had been rebelling, and how they had used a secret police to intimidate and imprison their enemies. And so what we ultimately see in Eastern Europe is a totalitarian government taking over. These countries went from being controlled by the Nazi totalitarianism to now being controlled by the Soviet totalitarianism, replacing one dictator with another, essentially. And not surprisingly, these Eastern European economies, they struggle. There's dissatisfaction, there's terror, there's hatred and anger towards the Soviet Union. And we'll see later on economic struggles as well. There's no innovation, no economic growth. So we'll say Eastern Europe is controlled by the Soviet Union. And there is no democracy, there's no freedom. Instead, it is one party, again, sometimes called Stalinism. Joseph Stalin in power until 1953. And this leads to a lot of dissatisfaction, and eventually rebellions. Now, Joseph Stalin dies in 1953. He had served in power for 29 years, 1924 to 1953. Soviet Union became what they were because of Joseph Stalin, for better or for worse. And once Joseph Stalin dies in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev becomes the next Soviet premier, the next leader of the Soviet Union. And he begins to introduce some reforms. This is called both de-Stalinization and the thaw. De-Stalinization is basically getting rid of some of the corruption and abuses of power that had been under Stalin. For example, under Khrushchev, Khrushchev gets rid of the prison camps where political enemies had been sent, what were called gulags. Khrushchev gets rid of the secret police, or I suppose he reforms the secret police so that they're not quite as corrupt and not quite as abusive. And he grants a little bit more freedoms to the people of Eastern Europe. Not full-on democracy, there's no elections, but a little bit more freedom of speech, let's say, a little bit more freedom of press. This is sometimes called the thaw. Think about the Cold War. If you take something that's frozen and you thaw it, it starts to heat up a little bit. And so the thaw is the idea that tensions begin to reduce with the West. Remember last week, we talked all about all of the conflicts of the Soviet Union, the arms race, wars in Korea, Vietnam, etc. This is that whole idea of détente. Things start to become a little less tense, and there's hope maybe for a peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev takes over after Stalin's death and introduces some reforms. Again, one is called de-Stalinization, and the other is called the thaw. De-Stalinization, again, is when he eliminates some of Stalin's abuses of power. For example, no more prison camps or secret police. And the thaw is the idea that there are reduced tensions and there is hope for a peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev's whole argument is basically, you know, Stalin held power for 30 years and he made the Soviet Union what it is, but he also created a lot of problems and abuses of power and animosity. He's trying to fix those problems. Now, that last bullet point, and this is kind of foreshadowing what's coming up next, is these gradual reforms inspire many Eastern Europeans to rebel. I always like to think of the old children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. I hope you all have read that when you were kids. If you give a mouse a cookie, he'll want a glass of milk. If you give a mouse a glass of milk, he'll want a straw, on and on and on. It's the same thing with Eastern Europeans. If you give Eastern Europeans a little bit of freedom, they're going to want more. If you give them a little bit of relief from a totalitarian government, they're going to demand even more. And so Khrushchev's attempts to introduce reforms backfires a little bit on him in that it inspires people to rebel and protest and demand more. And so in 1956 and 1968, Eastern Europe rebels. So Eastern Europe rebels. I'm actually not going to rewrite that because that's just above here. Two waves, 1956 and 1968. In 1956, Poland rebels, and they actually get a little bit of what they want. They gain more freedoms, more independence, the right to choose their own legislature, but they agree to remain part of the Warsaw Pact, which means they're still loyal to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union can still send troops there if they need to. And so the Soviet Union is like, all right, fine. It seems like a somewhat reasonable request. We'll still have power. We'll still control you. But sure, we'll give you these little freedoms. Hungary is a little bit more, Hungary is a little bit more hungry. really bad pun, sorry. Hungary demands more. They demand not complete freedom, but they don't want to be part of the Soviet Union. And so Khrushchev at this point, he says, you know what, nah, I'm not going to go for that. He crushes the rebellion. And he basically regains total control of Hungary. And what this basically shows is that it shows that the USSR is not willing to lose any of their nation. Poland was okay, that was a compromise, but Hungary was going too far. And so what Khrushchev says is, if you rebel, if you send people to the streets, if you knock down statues of Stalin, this is how we will respond. We will, through the Warsaw Pact, send tanks through your street to retake control. Famous photograph of Mikhail Gorbachev and President Kennedy, taken in the early 60s. So 1956, 1956, like a lot of revolutions throughout European history, ultimately didn't change much because Khrushchev and the Soviet Union reasserted their power, reasserted their control. They sent tanks into Hungary and retook power. There's one more wave of protests in 1968. All of the problems in the Soviet Union, all of the problems in Eastern Europe, they didn't disappear after Khrushchev. The dissatisfaction is still there. The economic problems still exist. And as we'll explore this more when we get to chapter 23, 24, as anti-war protests spread in the US and France, especially in 1968, those protests spread to Eastern Europe as well. Most notably in Prague. Prague is in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. In 1968, Czechoslovakia holds some elections because they had, a little bit of freedoms that were given to them under Khrushchev, but really, remember, the Soviet Union kind of pulls the strings there. Czechoslovakia elects a more liberal politician named Dubček, who goes against the Soviet Union. He introduces freedom of speech, freedom of travel. He weakens the secret police so they can't abuse their powers. And, well, think back to what the Soviet Union just did when Hungary rebelled. What did the Soviet Union do? They sent their troops in, crushed the rebellion. Soviet Union does the exact same thing. They send their troops into Czechoslovakia, they crush the revolt. So this is what's called the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. So I'll just say, I didn't spell Czechoslovakia right? Oh, all right. The Czechs elect a more liberal leader named Dubček. And the USSR is afraid that Czechoslovakia will become democratic and leave the Warsaw Pact. So the USSR crushes the revolt. This is an example of the Breznev Doctrine. Brezhnev was the next Soviet premier after Khrushchev, who basically says the USSR has the right to intervene, to get involved in the domestic affairs of any satellite nation, any nation that they control, if communism is threatened. And so what this basically allows them to do is it basically allows the Soviet Union to ensure communism remains, to ensure that all of these regions have single-party communism and that's it. It's funny to compare the Brezhnev Doctrine with the Truman Doctrine. The US says we will support free peoples resisting communism. Soviet Union says, nope. If there's any threat to communism, we're going to send our troops in and crush it. And so this dichotomy, this paradox, this contrast of photographs of these massive protests in the streets of Prague in 1968, followed by the initial shipment of Soviet troops. And then once the Soviet troops had completely taken control, there's no one on the streets. And so that's what oftentimes characterized the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. There's dissatisfaction among the satellite nations, Eastern Europe, but every time they rebel, with the exception of Hungary, sure, every time they rebel, sorry, with the exception of Poland, my bad, every time they rebel, their rebellions are crushed by the Soviet Union, and that totalitarian rule is reinstated. And so by the 1960s and 1970s, Eastern Europe is struggling immensely. Again, especially compared to Western Europe, the Soviet Union and its satellite nations are struggling immensely. Basically, there's a poor economy and there's a corrupt government. That's kind of the simplest way to phrase it here. With the poor economy, there is no innovation. There's a focus on heavy industry, which means like steel and tanks and weapons. But there's no focus on what people might actually need, like domestic needs. And there was kind of no motivation to work hard. Now, there was guaranteed employment. Everyone had a job. But if you're guaranteed a job, maybe there's no motivation to work harder or to create a new invention or create a new business, because everything was controlled by the Soviet Union. So corrupt government. The Soviet Union controlled the entire economy, which is oftentimes inefficient. And the government still controlled people's freedoms. It was oppressive. It put rebellions down. And again, this stood in stark contrast to the West, which was doing quite well. This map, this graph shows us, well, the US up top, so that's like Western Europe, the Soviet Union down here, showing how much product each country is creating. You can see the US started out much stronger, but they increased their lead over the next 50 years. The Soviet Union is stagnant. There's barely any growth, barely any economic growth over 50 years in the Soviet Union. And so the last main Soviet leader we're going to look at, Mikhail Gorbachev, really he is the last Soviet leader. Mikhail Gorbachev takes over in the 1980s, and he criticizes a lot of the characteristics of the Soviet economy and Soviet government. He says, well, the reason why we're in this problem where we have had barely any economic growth for the last 50 years is because the government has too much power, because we are controlling economic decisions, because people don't have the rights and freedoms to start their own government. And so Mikhail Gorbachev, introduces two reforms to try to improve the economy and also try to improve the government, to make it less repressive or less oppressive. This is called Perestroika and Glasnost. I'll be honest, I sometimes mix these two up. If you mix the two of them up, don't stress too much. But the important thing is to know that he does two things. Perestroika basically reforms the economy, and it allows for some private businesses. I'll say Perestroika here. No, I'm not going to do that. This was an acknowledgement by Gorbachev that maybe having a centrally planned economy where the Soviet Union controls everything, maybe that wasn't the best idea for economic growth. Maybe we got to have some private businesses to create innovation, new ideas, and economic growth. So he says, okay, we'll allow for some private businesses to try to restart the economy. And then Glasnost allows for more freedom of speech and freedom of press and some free elections, not total free elections, but some free elections. This is basically saying that we're going to allow groups other than the Communist Party to have a voice. Very quickly, some Eastern European nations released reports on the corruption of the Soviet Union. Now, Gorbachev's goal here was to try to save the Soviet Union. He realized that the people of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were unhappy because of 56 and 68. So he's trying to give them just a little bit of reforms to keep them happy, but still keep most of the power for himself. You can guess what's going to happen. If you give a mouse a cookie, he'll want a glass of milk. If you give the Polish people a little bit of rights, they're going to want full independence. Now, before those rebellions, Gorbachev was named Man of the Year by Time magazine because of these reforms. Sorry, I think this was actually two lectures that I combined into one. Yeah, so the Soviet Union is struggling to maintain its Eastern European nations because one-party rule, because of economic stagnation, which means no growth, and then anger over the Soviet Union having too much political control. There had been those two failed revolts in 1956 and 1968. And we'll see one last wave of revolutions in 1989 called the Velvet Revolution that ultimately will take down the Soviet Union. Called the Velvet Revolutions because partially because that was the color of the flag that many of them waved, and also because velvet is, you know, soft and fluffy, and these revolutions were nonviolent. And I guess nonviolence is soft and fluffy. So many Eastern Europeans, inspired by Gorbachev's reforms, rebel, or I'm going to say they protest and demand full independence. And so what we see is in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, all those same countries that had rebelled earlier, there are peaceful protests. There are free elections. And all of these countries agree through these peaceful protests and through these free elections, they agree to shift to democracy. And so what we ultimately see in 1989 is the Soviet Union goes out with a whimper, not a bang. There's no dramatic rebellion where the people storm the Soviet capital and arrest Gorbachev. No, there are just millions of people who take to the streets who demand a voice, who demand freedom. And since Gorbachev had given them that right, not much he could do to stop them. So when we track the collapse of the Soviet Union, much of the reason why the Soviet Union collapses is because the people wanted freedom. The people wanted independence. The people wanted a choice. And when the Soviet government under Khrushchev and then ultimately Gorbachev, when the Soviet government gave the people a little bit of freedom, a little bit of a choice, the people took it, they demanded more, and peacefully, miraculously, they succeeded and they created democratic governments. And so ultimately, the Soviet Union collapses in 1989. Those reforms of Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika failed to revive the economy and actually backfired, at least from Gorbachev's point of view, in that they inspired people to rebel. The Soviet Union lost control of those satellite nations because they elected democratic leaders. In East Germany specifically, the Berlin Wall, which had been a division between East Berlin and West Berlin, the Berlin Wall is torn down in 1990, and Germany will be united into one German republic soon after. And ultimately in 1991, if I'm remembering right, Christmas Day on 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns, the Soviet Union ends, and all of those Eastern European nations are officially free and independent. Again, ending with a little bit of a whimper rather than a bang, I suppose. So we'll say by 1991, Gorbachev resigns and the USSR is, I mean, they collapse, but they're just gone. Because Eastern European nations gain their independence. Some incredible photographs in Berlin, 1990. when the Berlin Wall first came down, and just the jubilation of, sometimes families who had been divided by the wall, who hadn't seen each other since the 60s, when the Berlin Wall was put up, being able to celebrate together. And this was all captured on live TV. Tom Brokaw was one of the great American journalists, was live in Berlin the night that the Berlin Wall finally came down, and the people could unite. Now, that celebration was a little bit short-lived, I suppose, because the last thing that we'll talk about, the last kind of new content, is how the Soviet Union collapses, and there's all of these new independent republics, democracies that are created throughout Eastern Europe. But the problem was, remember nationalism. Nationalism is that idea that I belong to a group of people, to a nation that has a similar culture and ethnicity and language and history. So we should be our own nation. Think back to Austria-Hungary, the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the Habsburgs were trying to rule over dozens of different nationalities. After the Soviet Union is gone, all of those different ethnic groups, all of those different nationalities want their own independence. And that's going to lead to conflicts in what was called Yugoslavia. This was the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of these different nations, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Macedonia, demanding their own nation. We're not going to get into all of the little specific details here, because we could spend months on this, and in the interest of time, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details. But what I'll say here is that Eastern European nations, Eastern European nations gained their independence, but there are many different nationalities in Eastern Europe that want their own nation. The best example of this is, best example of this is in Yugoslavia, which was part of the old Austria-Hungary. And this leads to civil wars and conflicts over kind of the creation of new nations. Again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of that, but the idea here is, we get rid of the big bad guy, the Soviet Union. These people are free and independent. Now the question becomes, how do they create a free, independent nation? Democracy is messy. Democracy can sometimes be violent. And that's what we see in Yugoslavia after '91. And so to wrap us up, I'm going to call just this kind of a conclusion slide. Eastern Europe, under the Soviet Union, faced many challenges. The Communist Party had total control. There's no economic growth. There's no innovation, all sorts of economic problems. And so the Soviet Union tries to introduce reforms. Khrushchev has de-Stalinization. Gorbachev has Perestroika, which is granting some private businesses, and Glasnost, which allows freedom of speech. But those reforms inspire revolutions. I should say inspire generally peaceful revolutions that ultimately succeed. Now, you had 1956 and 1968, where these rebellions are crushed by the USSR. But by 1989, with the Velvet Revolutions, they succeed. And the Eastern Europe, generally speaking, they gain their independence and their freedom from the Soviet Union. So I'll come back to those slides in a minute. But just to show how the map has changed, this was the map post-World War I, post-World War II. You can see Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union. And this is what it looks like now. So many new nations: Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Albania, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, etc. All of these countries built out of the old Eastern European Soviet Empire. Again, that's messy, but it's an attempt to grant nationalities of their own nation. Comparing the two, again, the old was these mega empires: France, Germany, Austria, Hungary. And the trend now is nations divided by nationality. And so as we wrap up here, we have, again, problems in Eastern Europe, attempts to create reforms. Pause if you need to. But if you give a mouse a cookie, he'll want a glass of milk. If you give Ukrainians some freedoms, they're going to want more. They rebel in 56 and fail. They rebel in 68 and fail. But ultimately, they rebel again in 1989. Again, peaceful protests, and they succeed. Now, those successes, again, don't solve the problems instantly, but there are so much more freedom, free elections, and nations drawn on actual, rational nationalistic borders rather than the Soviet Union having all the control.